So we just talked about the heart and what it does. So what is the heart carrying? Well, the heart is carrying blood, right? So blood is a type of connective tissue. This is called a connective tissue because it basically connects parts of the body together, right? The lungs and the heart are connected to the rest of the body through the blood. The lungs obtain oxygen and then sends it all over the body so the rest of the body can get that oxygen. So blood is a kind of liquid that carries oxygen and other kinds of nutrients, other kinds of chemical signals, all kinds of things all over the body. It also brings wastes into it so that it can be removed. Now, the blood is carried in blood vessels. So there's basically three kinds of blood vessels, and they're highlighted on this page. So the first type is called an artery. Second type is called a vein. And then there's these very, very small blood vessels that are called capillaries. So arteries and veins are pretty big, and then capillaries are very small. So what is the difference between them? Well, what do arteries do? So arteries are anything that carries blood away from the heart. So you think of it as arteries away. So arteries, they carry blood away from the heart. So when the heart pumps blood, either to the lungs or to the rest of the body, those are carried away from the heart through the arteries. The veins, they do the opposite. Once the blood is finished going wherever it needs to go, well, it has to come back to the heart. So the veins carry that blood back into the heart. Now, usually, the blood that is in the arteries is full of oxygen, right? That's why the heart is pumping that blood somewhere, because it's full of oxygen. Now, once it goes through the arteries and it gives away all the oxygen and it's coming back in the veins, usually that blood doesn't have very much oxygen anymore. Now, in the middle between the arteries and veins are these very, very tiny blood vessels called capillaries. Now, capillaries are very, very small and very thin. Now, they have to be thin because the capillaries is actually where the oxygen and carbon dioxide go in and out of the blood. So you see the arteries and the veins, they basically carry the blood somewhere, but once it reaches its destination through the arteries, and it actually needs to give the oxygen away to the cells over there, the arteries are too thick for the oxygen to kind of pass through. So the arteries become smaller and smaller and thinner until they become capillaries. And now the capillaries are thin enough to where things like oxygen and carbon dioxide and waste products can go back and forth from the outside into the blood. Now, once that's finished, these become thicker and thicker until they become veins. And then the blood goes back to the heart. So capillaries are kind of a connection between the arteries and the veins. Now let's talk about the blood. So what is the blood made of? Right? So if we take a look at this picture over here on the right, it kind of shows us what blood is made of. So blood is made of many different kinds of cells. We talked about cells, right? And it's also made of liquid, right? So let's suppose we separate the blood out into the different portions, all right? So let's take a look at what those different parts are. So over here on the top, right, about 55%, right, so a little bit more than half of the blood is something called plasma, right? So what is plasma? Plasma is basically, to kind of simplify it, just a liquid portion without the cells, right? So this liquid contains mostly water. It also contains salt, sugar, chemical signals, minerals, nutrients, proteins, all these kinds of small, tiny things and substances that are not cells, right? So this is basically like the purely liquid portion of the blood. That's called plasma. There's no cells in the plasma, right? Now, 41%, right, a large chunk of the blood, almost half, is red blood cells. That's what gives blood its red color. So what do red blood cells do? The red blood cells are red because they have something called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a substance that carries oxygen. So the red blood cells, this is why the blood is red. It carries oxygen. Right? Now a very small portion, you see this very thin layer here, a small portion is made of platelets and white blood cells. So what do these things do? The white blood cells, they basically fight infections. That's the main thing that they do. Right? So the white blood cells, right, they combat bacteria, viruses, sometimes cancer cells. They make different kinds of things such as antibodies. These are chemicals that fight bacteria. So white blood cells are basically important for keeping a person safe. In addition, in this small place right over here, we also have platelets. So what do platelets do? Platelets are basically these tiny substances that basically cause clotting. So let's suppose you cut yourself, right? And some blood starts to come out. Well, you don't want it to keep bleeding forever. So these tiny things called platelets, they go and they plug up that hole to stop the bleeding.